Welcome back. Last episode, the flock migrated south for the winter and started setting up shop in the ship of the enigmatic Charlon Whitestone, who apparently has nothing better to do than bum around the rim dropping off ships on random planets. Regardless of his reasons, I'm not complaining, because it was a whole lot faster to retrofit an existing ship than it would have been to make my own from scratch. Though it did have the unexpected downside of my new ship looking like a particularly misshapen phallus. It's fine, the whole thing's temporary. Rather than to try and fix all the many various and sundry problems this ship has on the ground and add more weight to an already overtaxed set of engines, I opted to just script the map drive any mineable resources, cram enough heat sinks and weapons onto it that it won't immediately get blasted back to the planet if we get in a firefight, and launch. Everything else we can fix later. The resource extraction phase is pretty fast, so while we launch and get ourselves situated, let's talk mechanics. First off, space is cold, and there isn't any air to breathe. Wow, big shocker. In order to prevent the obvious complications that come from sticking a fleshy meat stick in a freezing cold vacuum, pawns will need to be wearing some kind of EVA suit or a full set of recon, marine, or cataphract armor at any time they are in space, or on board a ship without an atmosphere. In practice, this doesn't make much of a difference to me since I already had all my pawns in cataphract armor, but there are mobility debuffs associated with moving through vacuums without an EVA suit, so they're not going to be using it unless I'm boarding or repelling boarders. The pocket dimension is obviously exempt from this requirement because the pocket dimension is a pocket dimension and magically produces oxygen through means beyond the ken of mortal man. Second, in space, very few events happen directly to the map your ship is on. Instead, most of them show up on the world map and expect you to travel to them, and we'll definitely be doing that because that is by far the easiest and safest way to get resources to expand my starship. A lot of the more rewarding ones require you to scan for them with a researcher, which is also why Coco Pop is still around. Sorry, Coco, you can't haul, clean, mine, or build, so that means you get to sit in front of a computer all day and maybe do some combat hacking later on. It's fine, we all contribute to society in different ways. Combat is where things get really interesting. Ignoring boarding situations, most combat doesn't take place between pawns anymore. Instead, ships will engage with other ships in combat from different map tiles and will launch projectiles, torpedoes, boarding shuttles, and other more exotic forms of weaponry at each other until one or both of the ships are crippled, their point defenses are breached, or one of the ships flees the engagement. This has the effect of simplifying the rules of engagement quite substantially. You're attacked, and if you can't or don't want to flee, you and the enemy trade shots and boarding crews until someone's shields or point defense is overwhelmed, and then depending on what is breached, the losing ship gets either blasted to pieces or boarded, respectively. In the past, my ship builds tended to focus on turtle designs and relied extensively on point defense, massive shield emplacements, and having enough energy reserves and energy production to outlast anything that was attacking me. I imagine that this will still work to a certain extent, but that version of the mod didn't have the new vehicle mechanics in play, and I definitely want to use some of those on this run, so we'll see. Now that I've plotted out a general idea for how I want my ship to look and everyone is dressed appropriately, we can get to the actually fun part, which is that I get to build a spaceship in Rimworld. Admittedly, this comes as something of a letdown when compared to the Odyssey DLC, which focuses on functionally doing this exact thing, but this mod came first, and the modding community for this game is absolutely nuts, folks. Anyway, much like my colonies, I like my ships big, I like them chunky, I like them round, and I like them armed well enough to cause enemy forces 16 parsecs away to spontaneously vaporize. This admirable life goal comes with some logistical complications. First off, as your ship gets bigger, more dangerous enemies will start showing up and trying to get a piece of the action, and if left unchecked, the runaway arms race to build bigger and bigger ships will straight up turn you into ship chunks for a future colony to salvage. That means my first and only priorities right now are defense, which comes in 3 flavors. Shields, which absorb damage, point defense that keeps certain kinds of damage away while it's up, and armor, which I never bother with because it's hella expensive to make, time consuming to repair, and is about as effective at tanking damage as a sponge made out of sodium is at absorbing water. The first step in any ship design is power, because without that your shields don't stay up, your weapons don't fire, and your pawns don't get to breathe. Save Our Ship introduces 2 main power generation mechanisms with a third unlocked after a very prolonged tech tree that I'm not going to touch on right now. The first is nuclear reactors. They burn fuel to produce 10,000 watts of power, with optional overclock modes to bump that up to 30,000, 50,000, or 70,000 at the cost of vastly lowered fuel efficiency and other mildly inconvenient things like your ship catching on fire after experiencing a thermonuclear meltdown. They are reasonably cheap, and their fuel consumption in their most efficient mode is conservative enough for casual use, but are otherwise nothing to write home about. The second option is solar, which is what I tend to go for. Save Our Ship solar panels are designed to be mounted on the edges of your ship hull where they have the space to unfurl themselves when the sun is out. They only generate 600 watts per panel and are a rather more expensive investment materials-wise, but they never break down or run out of fuel, so the real cost is the space they occupy and how easily damaged they are in combat. That is, unless you're me, because the first thing I tried when I saw this unfurling mechanic was to make a ball of the things unfurl over the top of each other in the middle of a well-protected area of my ship, and it turns out they function perfectly fine when you do this, in defiance of things like common sense and energy conservation laws. So with my energy infrastructure perhaps a little too well situated for the immediate future, I can then turn to the great Space Goose pastime of constructing way too much heat management infrastructure. Heat, and the ability to manage it, is a very important resource in space, and in addition to all the usual Rimworld reasons like not burning your colonists alive and spontaneously combusting everything they care about, it matters because it's the primary thing you have to manage when fighting other ships. When weapons fire or shields block impacts, they produce heat, measured in something called a heat unit. These heat units then get fed into whatever network is connected to the thing producing the heat, and if you stress that network too much, bad things start to happen. Bits of it can break, or catch fire, or leak dangerous levels of heat into surrounding bits of the room, and most relevant to ship battles, if you max out your heat network and shield emitters have nowhere to dump it, they spontaneously catch fire and fail, which leaves your ship exposed until you can fix them. All of these things are varying levels of no bueno, so getting a good heat management design is critical. Save Our Ship likes to pretend that there are three components to this, which are heat sinks, which provide a small amount of capacity to the network and slowly destroy heat into the void of space, coolant tanks, which provide a large amount of capacity to the network but only store heat and don't get rid of it, and purge ports, which consume silver to delete large amounts of heat and flush all of your molten silver into space, but otherwise provide no benefits. In my experience, Save Our Ship is completely and utterly wrong in this assessment, and the only true acceptable heat management solution is to spam heat sinks harder than a fake meat convention in Death Valley. In defense of my claim, consider the following. Any system that relies on purge ports is doomed to failure because ship versus ship combat tends to be a very long, drawn-out venture, especially if you're fighting NPCs with silver to burn, and if you're burning silver to keep up with them, the battle was lost before you opened fire. Coolant tanks can be useful to a certain extent by letting you artificially up your heat capacity on the cheap, but that's all they do, and it doesn't really matter if your ship overheats with 10,000 heat capacity or 1,000,000, because you'll still end up being a flaming slag ball in the end. The only structures that actually matter, then, are the ones that let you get rid of the heat permanently, which are heat sinks. The one drawback of this entirely flawless and well-thought strategy is the cost associated with it. Heat sinks, much like everything else in this mod, demand a massive amount of steel, plasteel, and advanced components to construct, and what you see here has almost entirely depleted my entire pocket dimension's reserve of raw material. This is where aggressive salvage operations, also known as space pirates, come in. You see, I'm not the only one who wants more goodies, and somebody decided that they wanted mine. This was a rather unfortunate mistake on their part, because their ship is physically incapable of penetrating my shields, and their assault team is so under-armored that they might as well just be free target practice. But it does make a nice example for how ship combat works, so here we go. At the top of the screen, we have stat readouts for the heat capacity and energy levels of my ship, which is called Charlan Whitestone for some reason, on the left, and the enemy fleet on the right. Observant viewers may notice that I have 3 times the heat capacity of a ship that the game thinks is a fair matchup for me. More on that later. The enemy ship also has, or rather had, 2 lightly armored personnel shuttles that they used to try and get borders across, but this did not go well for them. Even if both of them had made it through, though, personal shuttles only carry 1 pawn each, so they're not terribly dangerous. Once I mopped up the borders and determined that I was in no real danger, I'm left with the task of trying to crack this thing. My ship is substantially underarmed for its size and heat capacity, and like me, the enemy corvette is substantially over-shielded for a ship of its nominal weight class, and this leaves me pretty limited when it comes to taking the thing down. I don't have any torpedoes to soak its point defense, so getting my strike craft over there with a boarding crew isn't possible. We do so little damage that I can't overtax their heat sinks enough to build heat up in the main body of their ship, and we are so much larger and less maneuverable that I can't really close the distance and use lasers, which are a short-range only option, to help out my long-range railguns. This leaves only one real option, which is to exhaust their fuel reserves. Ship combat has a fairly simple way of simulating distance. You can use fuel in your engines to move closer or further away from the enemy ship, and they can do the same to you. Small ships and more engines mean you move faster, large ships and less engines mean you move slower, and fuel is burned at a constant rate determined by the size of your ship. This mechanic comes into play in a couple of areas. Weapons have range requirements, and in order to be effective or functional at all, you have to meet those, so sometimes it makes sense to maintain distances that are optimal for you but inconvenient for the enemy. But most importantly, the only way a ship can break contact in a battle is if it runs away from you, and if it doesn't have engines or doesn't have fuel in those engines, it can't do that. My ship is big, slow, and has a very limited complement of engines, but I have something the pirates don't, which is a pocket dimension with 16,000 units of raw uranium and an entire horse factory worth of chem fuel. If I can force them to burn their fuel, maintaining the current distance between our ships, they'll run out a whole lot faster than I will, which will allow me to close distance and trade shots with point defense weapons, which hopefully will crack their shields without them having a chance to run away. After a couple days, this is exactly what happens. I'm not fast exactly, but the only engine they had with any real amount of fuel in it was their primary nuclear fuel engine, and NPCs don't know how to refuel. So slowly, ever so very slowly, I can burn their engines down until their last one finally cuts off. Mind you, the ship is still far from helpless. This particular design has more point defense lasers than I do, for that matter, but in a straight-up slugging match, we are armed evenly enough that my greater heat capacity wins out. Their ship is forced to start venting coolant to keep their heat sinks operational, their shields go offline, and that signals the beginning of the end. With their defenses down, I concentrate fire on atmospheric controls to try and kill off as many of the crew as possible before I send in my salvage teams, because there's no sense making them do more work than they have to in securing the ship, and eventually it's mine. The next little bit is a waiting game. I need to land boarders to secure the ship intact, but the ship has a fully operational complement of point defense lasers. Fortunately for me, this particular ship design also doesn't have enough power generation to maintain those point defenses, so instead of risking getting shot down, I can just let them burn their energy reserves trying to punch through my shields, get in close, and hop over mostly unopposed. From there, it's pretty much a bog-standard Rimworld style raid, but in space. Spacer crews have some stronger weapons than you normally see on raiders, but compared to the fleet of centipedes that I was beating off back on the planet, they don't put up much of a fight, and soon enough, the ship is mine in whole. With the capture of the ship comes a whole heck of a lot of work for my pawns, who now get to slice the thing up into pieces and salvage it for parts. This is a fair bit more involved than the usual Rimworld approach, which is deconstructing everything to recover 50% of the material that went into making it, thanks to the addition of a structure called a salvage bay. This building lets me move unattached chunks of ship below a certain size around the map, and in doing so, I can save the cost and construction time needed to build the more expensive components, like heat sinks, by just cutting them out of the enemy ship wholesale, cutting a hole into mine, and then playing the fun kindergarten game of does the shape fit in the hole. It's still best to disassemble things like furniture and weirdly shaped bits of hull that I can't use, but you can recover a shocking amount of good stuff this way if you're willing and able to aim your shots carefully and take your time with the disassembly. And in doing so, I netted myself 2 large heat sinks, 4 large railguns, a new engine, a bunch of energy capacitors, and quite a lot of point defense lasers as a result. Also, as a side note, trying to recover shuttlecraft that you use to move your pawns to enemy tiles is extraordinarily buggy thanks to some unintended side effects of installing the Pocket Dimension mod, so the only way I have to recover interceptors are to park them inside the thing that I'm salvaging and then bring them over with the rest of the ship. I don't know if that's going to be a persistent issue with all events, and actually I later find out that it is, but at some point the Pocket Dimension is going to have to go because for other event types that is the only way of getting your pawns back. Of course, monetizing the poor life choices of random raiders isn't the only source of useful resources. Space, as it turns out, is absolutely chock full of random junk that a particularly enterprising colony can make use of if they're willing to go out and collect it. Case in point, Coco here has found something called a derelict mech sphere, one of the smallest classes of mech ships, just floating around collecting dust. What a wonderful treasure. Now, does it have a bunch of actively hostile mechanoids on board doing whatever it is that hostile mechs do? Sure. But, I mean, come on, that just means it's a bit of a fixer-upper. We can take care of that, no problem. Frostballs didn't need that bionic stomach anyway, right? Of course, stealing their ships does kind of tick the mechs off, but what do we care? Free stuff, right? So anyway, now that you know how the basics of ship-to-ship combat works, I should probably explain a few more things. As it so happens, Save Our Ship is one of those rare Rimworld WODs where being mostly pacifistic is actually to your advantage, and this is entirely due to how the mod calculates threat difficulty. Base game Rimworld calculates threat difficulty via a number of factors related to the number of pawns in your colony, colony wealth, and the time the colony has been on a specific map tile, but most of those don't have any relevance to ship combat. Which is a good thing, because the number of Muffalo burgers you can make obviously won't have any effect on how many depleted uranium slugs you can launch at your enemy. Instead, one of, if not the only, factor that determines your threat difficulty is the number and type of weapons and heat management tools your ship has. You can see this by pulling up the ship info panel on your piloting console and looking for something called a threat rating, and from the looks of things, salvaging the mech sphere has nearly doubled mine, even though none of the stuff on it is functional. On a more practical level, this is pretty easy to see when you compare the combat power of the Corvette I took out to the mechanoid sphere I'm fighting right now. The mech sphere fields easily 3 to 4 times as much firepower, and I'm only able to survive the initial alpha strike thanks to my abnormally massive heatsink capacity. Speaking of heatsink banks, there's another fun use to being able to see your threat rating, which is identifying what exactly gives you more or less of it. I'm not going to go into a detailed breakdown, mostly because I can't be bothered, but the most important takeaway is that heat sinks add far less to your total combat score than weapons do on a per damage absorption basis, which makes sense mechanistically, but has some very exploitable properties because it means you're actually better off building heat sinks to counter weapons than you are building weapons to defeat the enemy. What follows next is essentially the world's slowest arms race. As before, I don't have the weapon capacity to penetrate the mech ship's shields, but this time around, the mech ship absolutely can penetrate mine if I'm not careful. I had enough initial capacity to let me vent coolant and preserve them, but a full volley of the Sears plasma batteries is about 20,000 points of heat, and venting below that number will result in my shields failing. Instead, my Polonists are put to the task of frantically constructing as many heat sinks as humanly possible, as fast as humanly possible, in an effort to bring up my dissipation rate high enough to tank the fire. Each completed heatsink adds 1,000 heat capacity and adds its coolant to my totals instantly, so every one I complete buys me a little bit of time to stabilize. My eventual goal is to either build enough sinks to void the heat faster than the mechs can generate it, or, more likely, to survive long enough that the mechs run out of power. I do succeed in this goal, but rather than stick around for me to turtle the thing to death, the mech ship retreats after it gets bored, and I, for one, am entirely okay with that, because there's a very real chance they would have won if they just staggered their fire in a way that prevented me from venting. This little incident highlights a couple very important lessons for me to take forward. First off, I need to deconstruct salvage weapons as fast as possible after collecting them, or I need to install and use a cloaking device. Cloaking devices are effectively the default storyteller's recovery mechanic writ technological. When active, they prevent all non-bounty hunter ships from finding and attacking you at the cost of slowly and constantly draining your coolant capacity. Since coolant capacity basically translates to your ability to absorb damage, they aren't something you want to leave on all the time, but they can help out in situations exactly like this one that I just got out of, which was where a bunch of salvage was artificially inflating my threat rating. Unfortunately, I can't make one due to the second important lesson I learned from this venture, which is that I have no plasteel left in my pocket dimension. Period. All those years of mining plasteel that I did back on the planet, yeah, it's all gone. I used it. This is bad news with a capital B, because that means my advanced component assembly line is languishing, and with it, my ability to make more heat sinks. The only real solution is salvaging the mech wrecks I hauled in, so I do that, but salvaging damaged ship parts like this is slow and not terribly profitable, and I need some better quality stuff to break down pronto. Oh look! Better quality stuff. This particular brand of better quality stuff also happens to want to engage me in close range, and even after redirecting my point defense, all my point defense to start shooting its engines, the thing cannot possibly penetrate my shields, and is therefore basically just a free snack. Admittedly, it does end up being a free snack that can run really darn well, though. As before, my 2 railguns can't penetrate its shield, so I have to run it down to exhaustion before I can slowly whittle it down with point defense, which takes like 6 or 7 minutes on max game speed, but we do get there. Once I'm done with my best impersonation of a mechanical Komodo dragon, I'm faced with another choice: board, scrap, or wait. Boarding is best when you care about efficiently extracting as much as you can from a ship, but it puts your pawns at risk since you have to engage the crew in combat. Scrapping is safer, but less efficient because I'd have to shoot through the hull to break all the piloting and control systems, and with the way weapon fire enters the map, that usually results in anywhere from a quarter to half the ship getting blown apart in the process. The bombardment does, however, usually kill quite a few of the crew. Waiting, if you can do it, offers the best of both worlds. It lets the crew starve, so no combat, but you still get the ship after. It's also tricky to do with ships that have lost orbital control, since they will deorbit after a while unless you're constantly burning fuel to stabilize them, and you won't be able to recover them if they crash, so it only really works on ships that don't have big reserves of food on board. I opted to go with the scrapping route for this one. There is literally an entire galaxy's worth of ships that want to take me on, so efficiency doesn't matter too much in the long term, and its only piloting station is exposed enough that I could take it out without damaging too much of the surrounding ship. With materials comes another burst of expansion, this time targeted towards getting the superstructure of my ship built out. Hull and hull plating, as far as I'm aware, contribute nothing to your threat score, so this is basically a free action, as long as you're not actively in danger, and my heatsink game is well and truly on point at the moment, even if my ability to fire back is functionally non-existent, so the only thing I'm really in danger of is all of my free resource balls full of angst and plasma flying away from me at literally any speed at all. In the interests of showing off the full Save Our Ship experience without the bugs, I want to start migrating the contents of my pocket dimension into my ship at some point, but that's going to take approximately 30 bajillion years and will be very much an as time permits sort of project when it starts, so we're gonna be sitting here for a while. Oh, hey! Glad you're still around. It's been, quite a while since the last clip, and as you can see, I was busy. We've completed probably around half the ship's superstructure by this point, and if you look carefully you can see where I've started cramming stolen equipment into more permanent spots, but there is a notable lack of, well, stuff in almost all of it. This is because of a fun little problem called weight management, or more specifically, my complete lack of it. Having a small city's worth of real estate is great for doing things like spamming out heat sinks and solar panels, but it is remarkably less great at doing such fun and novel things as lateral movement in literally any velocity. In a more balanced ship design, this wouldn't be too much of an issue, since you could trade hits with the enemy until you crack their shields, snipe their engines with long-ranged fire, and either run away to lick your wounds or move into a more final engagement. I am not a balanced ship design, and am instead basically a glorified satellite that has crammed some bottle rockets in its rear end and is trying to waddle towards my lunch while holding a taser. I've taken 6 or 7 engagements off camera now, and while I didn't lose any of them by a long shot, I also didn't win any of them either, and am starving for literally anything to upgrade with. That's where this Scythian cruiser comes in. This ship design has concerningly high damage outputs, to the point that it presents a credible threat to even my heat capacity, but it's largely unique in that its thrust-to-weight ratio is roughly equitable to that of a brick, which puts it somewhere in the same galactic cluster as mine. More relevant to me, one of its engines spawned in with critically low fuel, allowing me to try and chase it down with only 80% of its full complement, which hopefully will let me exhaust its maneuvering ability before it blows the contents of its batteries all over my shield and flies away, which is what all the ships have done previously. To its credit, the cruiser makes a solid attempt at being the one that got away Mark 8, but it has so much energy capacity that by the time the AI gives up and tries to leave, I've gotten it down to only 2 engines and can just barely maintain velocity with it as it limps away. Rather than expose myself to its axial-mounted laser cannon, which very nearly cracked my shields multiple times during the initial engagement, I allow it to run far enough to get out of range, recover, and then dip in and out to drain its power reserves until it's safe to approach. Capital ship weapons like this can be nasty, but they also suck power like an anemic Roomba, so this thing doesn't take too long. And once all those energy systems are starved, the most effective heat generation options the cruiser has are nothing more than deadweight. Then comes the slow, for me, and painful, for them, and drawn out for the both of us, process of peeling away the tough outer shell, the emergency purge port capacity, and the coolant capacity to get to the juicy center. After closing distance, my point defense lasers can work, but even with that, the ship has a substantial ability to tank like a Chad, and I haven't been able to upgrade my energy production for the same reason that I can't upgrade anything else, so it takes a goodly long while to carve through it all. In a way, this is something of a blessing in disguise, since maintaining the in-combat status for so long gives me a good excuse to starve the crew out, which makes it easier to clean up when I salvage. On an unrelated note, you'll be glad to know that Rimworld Prime, in fact, does do same-day ship deliveries through an active firefight. I don't know what they pay those drop pod drivers, but I hope it comes with hazard bonuses, because this is not a fight I would want to try and sneak a delivery through. My ship is a rather messy eater, so cleaning up takes a bit, but just as I finish scrapping the main components of that cruiser, another one shows up on the horizon. This is a heavy cruiser, one of the newer ship designs that relies on extensive use of boarding parties with fire support from a bunch of interceptor and bomber shuttles. On the initial approach, my thoughts basically boiled down to, oh crud, we're screwed, because this thing is gargantuan. Like, it has more heatsink capacity than me, and I might as well be a flying brick of cheese at this point. Upon further inspection, however, that thought very quickly morphed into, oh crud, they're screwed and they just don't know it yet, because this is basically just me, but with a lot of shuttlecraft. And I eat shuttlecraft for breakfast. For starters, I have mountains of point defense, just like absurd amounts of point defense. This is mostly anti-torpedo defenses, since I actually want ships to land next to me so that I can scrap them when I defeat their mothership, but ships equipped to do bombing runs and the like don't land, and have to get within point defense range to fire, and also do approximately donkey for damage, so, you know, not really much good for anything other than extremely expensive skeet shooting practice. Seriously, I am at multiple points during this battle taking on the concentrated weapons fire of this ship's entire attack fleet, and it barely even registered beyond background radiation. I was originally going to experiment a bit with shuttlecraft once I got to space since they were new, but after seeing how they perform, I think I'm gonna pass. Their biggest and only dangers are, in order, tanking the frame rate, and filling half my screen with UI elements that obstruct the game window, and that's really about it. So that's the shuttlecraft, but by the time I got done slap-chopping them into pieces with high-intensity laser fire, round 2 has arrived in the form of lovely steel deliveries disguised as a bunch of raiders. Now, credit where credit is due, there is a lot of dudes, but by the standards of the raids I was facing on the ground, it isn't that many, and now that we're firmly entrenched in Save Our Ship, that unlocks a bunch of new tech for me to use on them, called shields. You remember how I was using those portable shield generators to create temporary bubbles of shielding when doing frontal mech assaults? You remember how they were incredibly overpowered, but this was balanced by them being vulnerable to EMPs, explosive area of effect leaks, and a very limited duration? Yeah! Ship shields do all the same things, with none of the downsides, except for when I forget to wire them into the heat network and they blow up on accident. Like their smaller cousins, they are also one-way, so if you were to, say, create a teeny little shield pocket on the outside of your ship and fill it absolutely chock full of things that raiders like to shoot at, like, say, turrets, the raiders will do the obvious thing, get stuck in front of a one-way shield, and proceed to play their first and only game of catch with the friendly neighborhood autocannon. The cannons don't actually even need to be loaded for this to work. The raiders will literally sit there popping shots off on an unusable weapon emplacement until they starve to death or give up and run off the map, and they can't hurt it because it's shielded. Future rebalance is coming soon, I hope, because this is absolutely broken, and the way I layer my shields with my designs means that I kind of have to exploit it, or I will have it exploited against me. Raiders also do this fun thing where they are weirdly fixated on hacking your airlocks. Even airlocks that don't go anywhere, like the access points for my solar panel arrays. This would be fine, and it makes sense from a breaching perspective, but it also has the interesting effect of baiting raiders around the backside of my ship into the still burning engines, which then incinerates them. Definitely some AI changes that need to be made here, folks. In summary, I can't damage this thing, and can't be bothered to chase it down even if I could. It can't damage me, and wouldn't want to try, so really the only thing that happens is it leaves behind a finder's fee in the form of a mountain of corpses pretending to be the world's worst door prize and some shuttles I can scrap. Whatever. Welcome to space, everyone. For now, I think I will leave this episode here. I'm a fair ways off being able to build all the really interesting stuff, which will come later, but this seems like an excellent stopping point. To that end, thank you all for your time, and I hope you enjoyed.